I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
But what gets people that we need to win to go vote is not just, say, agreeing with Harris or disagreeing with Trump. It's actually believing that if Trump wins, they'll lose the right to an abortion, or they will lose any of these other freedoms, right? It's not just knowing what Trump wants or what his position is, but actually believing that you personally will lose something if he's elected. And that's what gets people to vote.
Hi, friends. Earlier this week, Kamala Harris faced off against Donald Trump in a debate that is almost certainly going to be the only one. She kicked his ass all over the stage without seeming to bat an eye. Even though the setup was nearly impossible for her, she needed to be prepared but not mechanical, to know everything without being a know-it-all, to be a boss without being bossy, to smile but not too much, laugh but not too loud, show emotion but not look like an angry Black woman. From the moment she walked out on the stage and tracked Donald Trump down to shake his hand and wish him a good debate, she dominated the stage. Kamala Harris very quickly told the extraordinary TV and streaming audience about her specific plans for child tax credits, assisting new home buyers, and other parts of her forward-looking plan. And then she did what nobody in the history of ever has actually done. She turned to Donald Trump, called him weak, a disgrace, a failure, a laughingstock, and she dangled bait for him that he could not resist. She invited the entire home audience to go to his rallies and watch his bat-shittery and watch people leaving early because of exhaustion and boredom. Now, we all know that crowd size is his kryptonite. So after that, Donald's uncertain composure turned into unhinged, irrational rantings about post-birth executions, Haitians eating neighborhood pets, and how bad the ACA was. And for his trouble, the ABC moderators fact-checked him in real time, telling him and the audience in no uncertain terms that his claims were wild and inaccurate. And for the first time, they pinned him down on the fact that after campaigning for 9 years, he still doesn't have a health care plan. Now, all of that was par for the course for those of us who watch politics closely. But it brought home to a massive audience, some watching in bars over lots of beer and bingo cards, how unfit he really is. And it showed how talented Kamala Harris is. Beyond the baiting, she never missed a beat. She linked the war in Ukraine to the safety of Poland and Europe, and of course, the 800,000 Polish Americans who live in Pennsylvania. And he wouldn't even say he wanted Ukraine to win. In a moment of what was either enormous restraint or exquisite stagecraft, Kamala made it seem like she was avoiding calling him a motherfucker, leaving time for amazing post-debate social media mashups. It was glorious. But, and there is a but, this debate, as beautiful as it was, is unlikely to change the fundamentals of the race. Michael Podhorzer, author of Weekend Reading, former political director of the AFL-CIO, and one of the very smartest people in politics today, talks about this a lot in the conversation you're about to hear, which was recorded well before the debate. This country is divided and calcified, and the structure of our institutions will make every presidential race extremely close for the foreseeable future. So, as he says, this race is within the margin of our effort. We need to be working our tushies off to help Harris waltz and all the down-ballot Dems, because this election is necessary, but not sufficient for our survival as a democracy. I hope you'll listen, because this was one of the best conversations I've had on the state of American politics. We discuss what makes voters take action, among many other crucial elements to regaining power across America. And in another piece of exciting news, after this interview, this podcast will pivot a tiny bit to highlight women who lead progressive political change in this country. Because make no mistake, it is women leading the way, well beyond our presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. So if you're interested in interesting and powerful women and inspiring conversations about taking action and making change, please keep tuning in. Like always, please consider subscribing at www.freedomoverfascism.us. A paid subscription will allow me to provide even more content. But of course, all the content is free. Please enjoy this conversation. It's a good one. Michael Podhorzer, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Hi, it's great to be here, Stephanie.
Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
I have so many questions I want to ask you, and we just discussed a few of them, but let's start in some ways at the end. Where are we over the last couple of weeks, months? It's kind of hard to tell because time has collapsed on itself. A lot of things have changed in the presidential campaign, perhaps in the twilight struggle against fascism, as you noted. Can you tell us where we are in terms of, first, the campaigns plural, because it's not just the presidential, and then maybe we can talk about the more in-depth questions about fascism and how to understand this moment?
Sure. The risk of triggering some bad memories. If you remember, after Trump lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College in 2016, probably everybody listening to this was feeling a sense of dread about the future. We were told as he flipped three reliable Democratic states that were chock full of these white non-college voters, that Democrats really didn't have a path, right? Since then, in those five states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, there have been 27 statewide elections. That's for president, for the Senate, and for governor. They've lost 23 of them, right? Sit with that, right? We've gone through now an astonishing 8 years of history, whether it's the worst pandemic in a century, the only insurrection in American history, two impeachment trials, and we are in exactly the same place, which is that there is a solid majority of Americans who do not want Donald Trump to be president. There was never anything close to a majority that wanted that. And there is certainly not a majority that wants the policies that he's enunciated or what's in Project 2025. What determined every one of those elections, and what will determine what happens in whatever 63 or 62 days, is whether or not that anti-MAGA majority again comes out to vote. That's our work, right? There's a way in which reading the headlines every day, clicking on 538 to see the latest projection for the election, what gives us less idea of the world we live in than just realizing that, like you and me, we don't want that future. And that is what most people in America don't want either. And so, as reading at what I've written, what I've been speaking, I've been really boring and monotonous about that. As each day, like there's a new thing. Oh my,
Not that you're boring, but it hasn't changed.
there's all this noise out there that people like scamper over to say now young people of color are suddenly wanting Republicans or this or that. And it's all a distraction. What we knew in 2016 after the election, that American politics, unfortunately, is going to hinge on the outcome of elections in those three states I mentioned, in Arizona and Georgia, and now Nevada, right? That's the pivot point for where we're going to go. And we also know, unfortunately, that in all those elections, then the win is by, like in Wisconsin, 20,000 votes for Trump in 2016, 20,000 votes for Biden in 2020, right? Throw away your idea of whether the latest poll is within the margin of error, and remember that every one of these elections is within the margin of our effort, right? And There are more people in all these elections, in all these states, that have voted against them than have voted for them. We just have to make sure that they know again that their vote is needed to prevent that dystopian future.
Okay, so our audience is mostly activists, and we talk a lot about ignoring the polls. We also talk a lot about messaging, and primarily the messaging that comes out of your briefings. Anat is our goddess of messaging. And we've been seeing that finally the message is what you guys have been talking about for years. How does it feel right now in terms of excitement? Are people going to come out? I don't think there's any such thing as an undecided voter. I think there are people who are going to decide whether to vote, and maybe there are some Republicans that need a permission structure to vote. So, how does it feel right now in terms of college students and new registrations and all the things we need for this to come out on our side, even before we protect the vote? Where does that stand right now, do you think?
Yeah, if I can take a step back and sort of narrate this, seems, as you brought up at the beginning, of time collapsing on itself, right? And if you think about the day before Biden stepped aside as a sort of beginning of the story, right? At that point, even as everyone was panicking because they were reading that Trump's lead was getting larger, no one was noticing that the percentage of the vote for him had not increased at all since where it was in 2020. What was happening was that more and more people who had voted against him, or if they were new, would vote against him, were parking themselves in third party or undecided when they got asked by a pollster, right? They hadn't switched to Trump. Only maybe 4% of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 were saying they were actually going to vote for Trump. For the most part, the 20% of Biden voters had just parked themselves somewhere else. These are young people of color, all the people that we were told had just suddenly decided to realign to the Republican Party,
Right.
but they were just sad about their choice. And
The
the
double
day
haters.
and the day after 81-year-old Biden stepped aside in a very patriotic, important way, they just started rushing back because even without knowing much about Harris, they were just so frustrated. Let me give you a little bit of the reasoning for why that dynamic worked that way, which is that the really big majority of those 20% who just weren't willing to say they were voting for Biden were millennials and Gen Z. And for them, and it can be hard if you are not in that generation or not really clued in with your kids or really looking at it, their experience of entering the labor market is so different from what it was for everyone who entered before. For the most part, their hopes haven't materialized. Everything has been restructured to be more precarious. And we see it in all the polls that show almost no confidence in those generations in our institutions and a desire to overturn everything. And a lot of simple minded people thought, oh my God, all these people will want to go there. But they were rational enough to know that the overturning they wanted wasn't to lose the right to an abortion. It wasn't to lose their pre existing conditions. It wasn't to see their friends deported. And so they turned to who they had to vote for, who was going to slay that fascist dragon. And it was Joe Biden.
Well,
And he was saying that he was going to slay that dragon on behalf of this beautiful status quo we all want to protect. So if you're in the
right.
mindset I described, it's, oh my God, what kind of choice is this? And so when you take a poll, you're just not going to want to be a whole plus one and enthusiastic for the guy who's promising to do what you want and protect the system you hate. So when that was removed, and if you listen to how Harris has talked about it, she's reassuring on all of that, right? She's a different generation. It's a different thing. And so right off the bat, like those voters start telling pollsters, yeah, we're actually on board with this. We were always against Trump and MAGA, and that's where we are. Now, where this creates something of a risk for the next 2 months is that I don't know if you were at the Democratic convention. I was, and people were just exuberant. It was like everybody felt like they had just gotten a stay of execution, right? And we're just really pumped. That is great and necessary for us to win, but don't take for granted that everyone else feels that way. And because what activates the anti MAGA majority is not just messaging, but the belief that if Trump is elected, he will do a national abortion ban, et cetera. And Harris, in her acceptance speech, really captured that there are two parts to what has to happen. The first was finally someone who was willing to say that Trump is an unserious person, to bait like what Walz did by calling them weird, right? It is always an essential element in fighting wannabe dictators at the polls to be clear that you think they're clowns and bullies, right? And unfortunately, the Biden paradigm was that they themselves were deep and powerful threats, right? The second
Right.
part, though, is that even if they are clowns and unserious people, if they're elected, if we give them power, the consequences will be very serious, right? And we can't lose that part. We can't lose the part of convincing our friends, the people we talk to, and so on, that it isn't that we don't have to worry about them because they're clowns, but that we have to understand that if they win, all those things will happen. But the only way they can win is if we don't stand up and do our work now.
We've got this exuberance within the Democratic Party. We've got generations who are skeptical. We have an unmoving MAGA constituency that will believe in him no matter what. He's not gaining any new voters, but he's also not losing very many. And you talked about the margin of effort. And we talk a lot here about what we can do to make sure that we're doing our part. And I ask people to take the messaging around freedom and then just go talk to everyone they know. Can you explain what you mean by the margin of effort and how you see that playing out?
Sure. Let me introduce a way of thinking about how elections work that isn't really the way the media reports it. There are a substantial number of people in this country, maybe as many as 90 million or so, who vote in every election no matter what, because it's the first Tuesday in November, right? And that group is more conservative, more Republican, whatever label you want to put on it, than the rest of the country. Okay. There are about another 100 million people almost who have voted at least once over the last couple of elections or had ever voted or just coming into the electorate, right? They, for the most part, are not habitual voters because they're not really thrilled with the political system. They don't really think there's much efficacy in voting. That's why they're not habitual voters, right? For them, what gets them to the polls is first what's called loss aversion, right? It's not about making a decision in this sort of side by side comparison on issues of who, like you think, will be a better president. It's if there's one or maybe a few things that you think will be worse in your life if they get elected, right? After that, it's whether any of the many identities we all carry around really get triggered. And then after that, a very small number of people actually looking at policies and stuff like that. But what gets people that we need to win to go vote is not just, say, agreeing with Harris or disagreeing with Trump. It's actually believing that if Trump wins, they'll lose the right to an abortion or they will lose their any of these other freedoms, right? It's not just knowing what Trump wants or what his position is, but actually believing that you personally will lose something if he's elected. And that's what gets people to vote. And polling masks that because polling is just making a decision between a couple options on your computer screen or talking to a pollster on the phone, right? It's like the difference between if you're still a smoker and the pollster asks you, are you going to quit smoking? And a lot more people are going to say yes than actually do, right? Even though they want it to. Because quitting is a behavior, wanting to quit is an opinion. Being for Harris or Trump is an opinion. Deciding to actually go out and vote is a behavior. And behavior is almost always triggered at a more visceral level than it is people making a rational choice. Let's see, is it really worth the mileage or whatever, right? That's not what it
Mhm.
is. And I hate to use a football metaphor, but it's not really. But it's like at the beginning of this year, like the 49ers and the Chiefs did not have the most fans of any Super Bowl matchup ever. But the viewership for this Super Bowl was higher than any in history. Why? Duh, Taylor Swift. Because it became buzzy, because people were like, oh, there's a thing. Oh, there's a Super Bowl party. Oh, whatever. I have no idea what a line of scrimmage is, but I'm going to get up and do a behavior, which is go to my friend's house to watch this game. That's what we have to do now is that social dimension that triggers people actually doing the thing rather than expressing an opinion about it on a poll.
So, if I understand correctly, you believe that they have to think that the way they're going to vote is actually going to change their lives.
More precisely, that voting is a veto on a future they don't want, which is different from just a more generic, oh, it'll affect me. That the
Right.
group of voters we're talking about, for very good reason, are enormously skeptical that any politician will make their life better. But they're convinced
Right.
that politicians can make their lives worse because that's their entire adult life, right? And so that's credible, right? Another way of thinking about what the election's like for this group of contingent voters is it's more like a ballot initiative than a candidate choice, right? If you make it into the national referendum on an abortion ban or fill in the blank, then the path to the polls is clear. And one of the things that was so important about Harris, not Biden, is so many of us now feel less cringy telling people to vote that we're now like
Hmm.
ready to go out and say, have you voted yet? Have you voted yet? And all of that, because you know that you're not going to get all these eye rolls, that people aren't going to say, oh God, here are the things I don't like about Biden and all of that. And that
Hmm.
sort of creates that Taylor Swift energy.
So, how do you get folks who live in either battlegrounds or, as we say, power building red states to believe that anything they do will make a difference, given that in the red states, there's the statewide supermajorities in the state houses, and in battleground states, it's on the edge? Is that a bigger motivator? Obviously, it's a bigger motivator in the battleground states, and we see the differential on voting numbers to be big on whether people think that they can make a difference. So, how do we reach the millennials and Gen Zs and the people who have been double haters and disaffected, but really want to protect abortion to think that their vote can actually make a difference?
Yeah. So I think you're asking the hardest part in a way, which is with 60 days, what can you do in a red state that is going to matter? And there are a few specific things that will for sure matter that people should pay attention to. If you are in a red state, but live in a congressional district or in a state legislative district that is not already clearly blue or red, it is really important to run up the margin for our side in those places. Is remember that on January 3rd, the new House of Representatives reconstitutes itself. And we look at how close the margins are now. I think if Harris wins, the odds are that there'll be on paper, like theoretically, a Democratic majority in the House too, but awfully close. And so if you think about then 3 days later, the next January 6th, and the potential of a vote on accepting the electors, that competitive congressional district in your state is about that. And we saw in 2022 in the midterms how even in blue states, Republicans picked up seats because voters didn't realize it was also an election on whether to elect Kevin McCarthy or Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. So right off the bat, it's like the immediate thing. We have to win every House seat in those states if we want to be in the best position to defend a victory. Okay. After that, the same kind of with state legislatures, because remember how much mischief they've tried to create after the election before, right? There were all those ridiculous but intentionally conceived to undermine the results of the election, quote, audits in those states, right? Get more Democratic state legislatures, not going to tip the body overnight, but it matters, right? And so that's like, give me 2 months in red states. It's about the best I can do.
You need 10 years for that.
Not even. I think it's really important to recognize what Stacey Abrams and all the people around her managed to accomplish over several cycles. There's no one cycle solution to being that far behind. Look at the way in which the courageous campaigns really, that were run to get rid of Joe Arpaio in Arizona, paid
Mhm.
off after a few cycles.
Yeah, you have to get people to run in the uncontested seats. And we talk about this all the time on this podcast, is that you have to run in the uncontested seats because there's a lot of votes you're just missing out on. And the top of the ticket could really use those votes in particular states. And last week, we also talked to David Callahan, who's telling people where to put their money. And he talked about two particular movements in California and New York to remind people that there are seats there that are really important to flip the balance of power. People in blue states don't necessarily they have to do stuff too. And having spent the first half of my life in California and the second half of my life in Massachusetts, I understand how easy it is to get complacent, right? I'm in Massachusetts. I'm never going to leave. Or if I do, I'm going to go to another blue state. I'll be fine. But I've done work in Indiana and they're not fine. They're nowhere close to fine. All right. So we do what we can in the red states and we try to run up the margins in the parts of the battleground states where we know we can win and we can pick up House seats. And we really hope to God that John Tester can pull it out in Montana. So I've been reading your stuff, and the first thing that really grabbed me was a couple of years ago when you said we have this faction in American history and politics that has been oligarchical and white supremacist from the very beginning. And that's who those people are now. And then you talked about how the biggest differentiator about whether people will vote for Trump or not is, and I'm telling you all the things that you said, isn't just college education, it's racial resentment. And then you talked about labor unions this week. So, how do we sort that all out? Or does it really not matter? And we really have to focus on the sliver of people we can get out to vote in places where it matters in 62 days.
In 62 days, that's absolutely what matters, right? There's no grand solution to the problems we haven't solved for 250 years to recommend for people that hadn't thought of that. We can do it right away, right?
Let's change the Electoral College before November.
That's not happening. But, you go back to a loss aversion where that is the reason we're always in the most important election of our lifetime, because losing means not being able or being much harder to make progress. It's a precondition to progress. It's not progress itself, right? And as someone who like California and Massachusetts, right? You are in on a really big secret about America, which is that in half the country since Barack Obama was elected, things have gotten much, much better for people. The right to an abortion is more solidly protected until the Supreme Court showed up. Regulation of AR-15s and firearms, you were safer. While the big story about America is voter suppression and all the fascist things, blue America is like 150 million people where we've just seen enormous strides towards multiracial democracy, right? It is easier to vote in all of these places, right? We have to just accept that our constitutional and federalist structure means that it is a pretty high bar, an enormous amount of power for us to be able to make that the law of the entire land, right? But if we let them into power, all that progress we've been able to make is in jeopardy. And over time, like the number of states and the number of people living in those states who become more blue will increase, right? But this is a problem that our founders bequeathed to us. And it's one that our commentators and our polling keeps blinding us to, right? Which is that we are not one national polity. We're not one demos, right? We are not as individual voters sovereign in questions of what the nation's going to do. The 50 states are. And control of those states in red states can be easily hacked by theocrats and the extractive industries and so on, right? And that's why we're at loggerheads.
Yeah, and to say it even more specifically, when the founders created this country, they needed to find a way for the extractive industries, the enslavers, to be part of it so it would be strong enough to survive. Yet we're reaping the rewards of it 250 years later because our structures and our institutions are still stuck.
I know it's like pretty hard to believe that in 1789, they couldn't just develop the perfect system of government for us living in the 21st century. That
When there had been no democracy anywhere anyway.
it's right. Where sort of that founding story really slips up is that even though the first words of the Constitution are "We the people," it was really "We the states." And the way to think about it is more like a mutual defense treaty. And as you were observing, there were a lot of threats. There was not a nuclear power back then, right? We were not that. We were threatened by England, by Spain, by the French, by the Native Americans that we were like beginning the genocide of, right? And they were looking for a way to be united against all those threats. And in that context,
Right.
the states that were not engaged in slavery felt that on balance, that was a better thing. But it's really better to think of the Constitution as the document that made sure, the pact that made sure that America didn't become the country that was imagined by the opening rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence. And it was protection against becoming that country.
And it's all encoded anyway, right? The Declaration of Independence, all men being equal is, yeah. And I think it's hard for people to. So I'm a historian, and here's my theory on how Americans view history. So tell me if you think I'm just completely off my rocker,
Got it. Yeah.
because I am occasionally. It's that we're so young. We're perpetually thinking that where we are is where we're going to end up. That this time, this continuum of history that goes back many thousands of years and will continue, is that we're actually at the end of it, that it's linear, right? And where we are now is where we're always going to be. And therefore, there's no changing it. But also, we're at the apogee of anything ever. And that's simply not true. There have been periods of history where countries have done better and then have really fallen behind. People have massive pandemics, wars, guns, germs, and steel, right? So, my theory is that it's really hard for Americans to understand that what we're doing now is part of a much larger continuum rather than the end game.
I think I mostly agree, but I could try to restate it a little bit differently.
Oh, good, because maybe you can make it not sound so crazy.
And also extend, like, I don't, this is a human phenomenon, not an American phenomenon.
No, yeah.
It's that so this is a podcast for maybe some people will be familiar with this term, but there's a term called hegemonic common sense. And the idea of it is that there are certain things that everyone in the society believes that don't make any sense because it advances the interests of those in power. And it is very difficult to think outside that box. And so it's disputed who actually said it first, but there's a great line that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Okay, yeah.
And that's, I think, the phenomenon you're talking about is that it is really hard to imagine a different future for almost all people at all times and places. And then periodically, in a big way, that gets shaken up and there's a new common sense that everybody accepts, right? And sometimes it's much more progressive, right? And sometimes it's much worse. Being old enough to have lived in the world before neoliberalism, when I was growing up, the equally sticky idea of how things work for America was pluralism, that you had
Mhm.
labor, you had business, and you had government. And like people really didn't pay attention with these microscopes to polls and like believing that what voters one by one is what we should add up. It was like there were different segments of society that were vying for power and we understood how to do it. And then suddenly it wasn't, right? And suddenly the
Mhm.
only way you could think about things is in all contexts, a kind of market rationalism that we're all atomistic. We don't think about social relationships. We just, everything is aggregated preferences. And you can't get yourself from here to a better world if your mind's stuck there, right? And I think that's a lot of what you were trying to get at, maybe that it's especially if you like aren't lucky or unlucky to have your life straddle two of these, it's really hard to imagine a different world, right?
It's the event horizon. We haven't lived through the cataclysms. I think about somebody who was maybe born in the 1880s, right? Like my great grandmother. You had immigration, the war, the flu, the depression, the war, and there were several completely world altering situations. But at this point, things have been pretty steady for a long time,
Absolutely.
not on an individual level. There's a long way to go.
But it also, the hope things were going was like, but history tells us there's good reason to hope and fear, right?
Mhm.
That those moments do come. And when they come, right, they're that everything's reshuffled. It remember that less than a century ago in the Depression and the 1930s, before say 1934 or 5, right? We didn't have unions like we have now. In fact, if you tried to organize in most places, they'd send National Guard or Pinkerton and get away with shooting you.
Mhm.
And inequality, all the things like that were like actually worse functionally than they are now. Because not only were like the ratios what they are now, but you were talking about squalor then, right? And
Right.
right? And so there was one of these rips in time because of the Depression. And we people rushed in, we sat down in auto plants, we did all these things and changed the balance of power, right? We got more power. And that's how history moves. Nothing happens, and then a big thing
Boom.
happens, and it goes in one direction or the other.
When we think about the Depression, all the things that you say are true, and yet the way out of it, the New Deal, only focused on white people, right? So the Black community wasn't a beneficiary of the GI Bill, didn't apply. So there were still levels, right? And I'm thinking right now about the pandemic. I have a 16-year-old. His life, the way he lives it, I think was very changed by the fact that for 2 years he didn't see anyone. With Gen Z, we don't know what's gonna get them to do anything. We don't know how they're gonna adhere or disadhere. So I think it's actually really exciting to watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so let's wrap up by just telling people where they can find more of you and talking about the briefings and making sure they're keeping up with what's really going on and not the stupid crap in the corporate media. If you can talk about where they can find really great information and analysis and messaging and instructions.
Sure. The main thing of this is I publish a Substack weekend reading, which hopefully can put in the notes. And Anachenko,
I
who you
will
mentioned
absolutely do that.
earlier, has several places you can go for great, constantly updated messaging. Probably the most relevant is,
Including here a year more than a year ago. Yeah.
yeah, Freedom Over Fascism. And that's where I'd start.
Thank you so much for coming on. I have wanted to talk to you for a really long time.
Thank you. That means a lot.
And we've got to win in November, but it's necessary, but not sufficient. And
Absolutely. Right.
as we keep
And that
going.
you have to, not to be both upbeat and not, right? We have to avoid what I called right after the 2020 election, the great forgetting. And by great
Right.
forgetting, what I mean is that during the Trump years, suddenly it was like a light came on and everybody realized all the serious problems in this country and all of who they were and what they were about. And then as soon as the election was over, almost everyone wanted to think none of the things they thought a minute ago really mattered and they could go about their normal business. Right. And we keep making that mistake when we win. We can only see these crises. We can only care about George Floyd. We can only understand what's systemically wrong here when we're not in power. Right. And then when we are, we just move on. And we can't make that mistake again when we win this time.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you can, please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.